Now here's the thing. Management of expectations has something to do with bias. And thinking about bias, I'm wondering what ours are. Because I heard something earlier on today in that, from my favourite new guru, Nick Hall, in that there's a Chinese proverb that says, everything that we see, everything that we hear, is what we've already made up our minds about in our heads. So we perceive it, we hear it, we see it the way that we already believe it. Which actually, when you think about it, is an interesting way of discussing bias, because it means that none of us are unbiased at all. And since this is an unconscious thing, it's going to be a bit of an interesting discussion, I think. So, ladies, it's ladies' night. And we're going to be all biased. Because we have no men.
Well, I guess we're recording in March, and we had International Women's Day this month as well, didn't we? Did we not have an International Women's Week or something? Or yeah.
Oh, it's like hen nights. They now last a month. So, you know.
I went to one of them in March as well. There we go.
What, a hen night? Ah, I haven't been in a hen night for quite a long time. Although I suppose that during lockdown it wouldn't be the done thing to walk around with a potty full of salt and dressed up with L plates on, going in and out of pubs looking for people to kiss you.
I don't think the hen parties that happen these days still go along those lines, Leslie, but that's okay.
I think that depends on where you come from.
Or where you are now.
Yes. You see, that's a thing. That's a bias.
As bias. Well, I prefer the word we all have different perspectives. It sounds much more palatable when we call it perspective rather than bias. Bias, I get judgy. I find it quite a judgmental word, bias.
Yeah,
but I would absolutely agree. We all have it in everything. We all have, because we come into every situation. So of course we've bias. Doesn't matter what we're doing, we have bias.
And basically we don't really have a choice in the matter to a certain extent, because we're not born in a vacuum. Although, so we take on the bias and the understandings and the experiential ways of our parents, of our surroundings, of our siblings. That becomes our world. We learn to be prejudiced. We learn to be distinguishing people or things by if they're good or bad from someone else's example.
And so maybe bias is another way of making a judgment. It could be an unconscious one, because we talked, or you mentioned unconscious biases there as well. So it could be an unconscious judgment. But I'm also wondering, is it another way of saying that it's the filter or the lens that we put onto whatever the subject is, that we're looking through, each one of us is looking through a different lens to see what we see, to make those snap judgments or biases? Is that perhaps a different way of looking at it?
I suppose it's a bit like beliefs and values.
There's multiple ways.
Sorry, Mary?
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. It is a different lens, but we use very different languages. So sometimes when we talk about bias, we talk about it with a very negative connotation. When we talk about it having a different lens or a different perspective, it doesn't seem to be so weighted as being that we can develop a consciousness of our own bias. It doesn't take it away. It just simply makes us aware of it. And when we are more aware of the bias or perspective that we bring to the table, then I think our ability to hear somebody else's view changes, because we recognize that there's a weighting on it. And it's like you mentioned there earlier this evening when we were chatting before we started this call. You know, if we're nodding, agreeing with somebody, we have cultural pieces that contribute to this concept of bias because it's our shared experience. Yes, I understand you. So head nodding is a big one for nurture, feeling, yeah, I'm absolutely, yeah, I'm on the same wavelength as you. Whereas if I'm going, no, I'm telling the person I don't agree, and I mightn't have opened my mouth at all. But that all comes from perspective.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, there's also the certain countries where shaking your head means yes and nodding your head means no.
Or that fun
Sorry,
little bob
I
as
had a
well.
bias that I only understood my own culture.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. But interestingly, something that I was looking at was cloth bias, textile bias, cutting things on the bias. That that really kind of tickled me when I first found out that that had a bias as well, and it was more or less a case of figuring out where I've put that, and looking at it as something that if you cut something on the bias, it's to stop it from fraying. So there's an anchoring point there. There's a sort of within that word there are so many connotations because there's so many ists
Huge.
within that judgmental part of the bias when it comes to particularly being biased and cognitive biases. The therapeutic bias, which is what you were saying just there about the nodding and agreeing, particularly with a client, we were discussing in that we're taught to a certain extent by some trainers that we should never either agree or disagree. We should just be there to be the conduit, to be the vessel of what's coming along, because sometimes it may encourage the person who's talking to you to stay inside their stuff, to not come out of it, because if you're agreeing, then it's giving them this kind of absolute right of yeah, I knew I was right, I knew I was right to think that, and it just kind of feeds that emotion. And what we're trying to do as therapists on many occasions is to remove the emotive part of that and maybe cut that on the bias so it doesn't fankle all out of the place and make a mess and leave threads everywhere. I think it's an interesting, it's such a small word, but with most small words it has a big remit. Absolutely amazing. I mean, it's both a verb and a noun, which is crazy when it comes to what it means to everybody. So when it comes to like prejudice and things like that, I mean, there's all the ists that are in there, and I think that also it's true. You can become prejudicial, you become biased for or against something, and not even realise that that's what you're doing, because it's just it's just right to you, or it's wrong to you. But is that underneath? Is the underpinning of that beliefs and values?
Isn't the underpinning of most things beliefs and values?
Yeah, but how much of an underpinning is it? Is it a real solid thing, or is it just something that, because beliefs can be changed, but it's very difficult to change them. Bias, however, you can talk someone round a bias, can't you? Some of the time.
So I think if it's a conscious bias, so when someone highlights an unconscious bias, it becomes a conscious bias. And then you can start to think about it and question it. But I'm wondering if there's still that part of the intuitive response to something that even if you are aware of it and you've been talked around it, there might be still that original voice, for want of a better word, that throws in that original bias again. I could be wrong on that one, but I'm wondering if that is perhaps.
No, I get what you're saying, because basically it's a case
Yeah.
of once we do that, once we get round into that conversation, that's the point where it's almost like sticking the thin end of the wedge into the situation, where you have the choice of opening up that person's ideas or understandings, or they won't let you. and they'll sit and they'll nod their head and say yes, 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 like I'm agreeing with you, but actually I'm not, because I just don't like conflict. So I'm going to keep my bias to myself.
It's almost that the nod and wave boys from Madagascar, isn't it? Yeah, just agree.
Just on wave, they'll go away in a minute, and then you can go back to your familiarity.
It's interesting because I feel that when I'm doing that nod of my head, I'm acknowledging that I've heard you. I'm not necessarily saying I am agreeing, but it's interesting that then if the perception is that me nodding my head is giving the other person that power to go deeper and feel as if they're being acknowledged from the perspective of agreement and acceptance, I can understand where that could be a challenge. But then perhaps that's my bias, is that me nodding my head is that I'm acknowledging I'm hearing you.
Yeah. Well, one of the definitions from Wikipedia on cognitive bias is that it's a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. Individuals create their own subjective reality from their perception of the input. An individual's construction of reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behaviour in the world. And so through this bias, people tend to favour information that reinforces the things that they already think or believe, which is a bit like saying the Chinese proverb of, you'll only actually hear and see what you already believe to be right in your head.
So it's the filter that you're applying.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly when it comes to NLP, we're really good at dealing with filters because we know they're there. So in using the different representation systems, the five senses, by using those, depending on how we're hearing the other person, we're actually shifting our bias a little bit when we're coaching and when we're being therapists to allow that person to be in rapport with us, so that we can actually winkle out what's going on with that, get into the oyster shell and see if we can find a pearl in there, which is really interesting because of course it's an irritant. So
Are you likening irritants to therapists?
Well, I don't know about you, but I can be occasionally.
I never would have guessed.
I know, it's a terrible thing. People just don't, it's just not right. But then I'm biased.
I wonder to what extent, I think as coaches, as therapists, we have looked at our biases. It is like, I don't know any other, I don't think I've ever encountered a coach who wasn't aware of the potential for bias in their communication.
But
I wonder, is that something that the general public are equally aware of? Are we all aware? Or do we have a level of awareness that we're going around with a very biased view of the world? And if you take the coaching piece out of it,
I'm not entirely sure that generally we are aware of our biases until they actually come up and slap us in the face. Because when we're biased, when we are in our biases, we are with other people whose biases match our own, for the most part. It's only when we go outside of our usual patterns, our usual ways of thinking, our usual watering holes, do we actually find other biases. And it's going to get worse, particularly with Google and other search engines, because as soon as they see a preferential thing going on, which is a bias, they will throw more of that at you. And so it takes the rest of the information away that might actually change your mind about something or allow you to see something in a different way.
You're talking about kind of the echo chamber stuff of you only get to see what you're looking for over time, and so the AI allows, the algorithms provide you with that. So yeah, I can see that point. My first foray into unconscious bias was actually in my last corporate role, where we had a workshop on it, where we talked through what it was, and it was around the hiring process and what biases that you've got when you're looking at interviewing candidates for the roles. So I don't think it's just a coaching thing. I think it depends on, I suppose, if someone in the organization that you're working for is aware of biases or has done bias training in some way, shape, or form, there's a good chance that that then will be rolled out to other members of staff to then roll out further. But I guess it depends on the organization and what level you're at and the role that you're doing.
Do we think it's all about as well matching expectations, managing expectations?
I'm not sure. So I did cultural awareness stuff in a previous company and job role, which was a very bizarre cultural awareness thing when I was taught how to deal with Indian people. And being half Indian, that was a really interesting conversation.
That's a bit like taking polls to Newcastle, wasn't it?
Oh, it was really interesting because the trainer didn't quite know what to do with me when I was giving answers from both sides of the wall, and it was just bizarre.
Yeah.
So yeah, it made me very amused. I must admit, I did learn some things, and I got some, okay, now that makes more sense as to why I do this or why I do that. So it did enlighten different aspects for me, but it amused me too. So I think from that perspective, the cultural awareness piece is different to the bias piece. And now I've forgotten where I was going with that. So maybe you can pick up for me where I was going.
Yeah, I think but I think, yeah, the cultural awareness piece, I think that it is linked to the bias piece in the sense that when we actually stop and perspective, when we think about how they might view the world differently, whether we call it cultural bias, whether we call it political bias, whether we call it gender bias, sexuality bias, whatever bias it is, the very fact that we actually start looking at it and addressing it and making it like that, bringing it to consciousness, then there's capacity to change the bias or change the power of bias.
Is there a risk? So what I mean by that is that shining the torch on it to then the people that are normally quite well aware of themselves as people, and I'm struggling with the words to look for right now, but for the people that are quite self-aware and don't want to hurt the feelings and everything else of other people, are we running into the risk that people then may find that they can't speak for fear of going down the route of one of these biases and what that might highlight?
That's kind of interesting because that's kind of managing expectations that are our expectations and not theirs. Because we might be thinking about trying not to hurt someone's feelings when actually they don't feel the way that we think they feel about it.
And that's what I meant by that risk and that danger piece, because
and
you might then find that people keep themselves to themselves a little bit more for fear that they might say the wrong thing to someone from a different ethnic background, from someone of a different gender. I mean, we've got mansplaining and all the rest of it, but you've also got the different sexual orientations and trans issues as well. Where does that all fit in? And do you end up in a situation where you run the risk of being so terrified of saying the wrong thing that you'd rather cross the street to avoid somebody and not talk to them at all in case?
Well, I think that that's entirely possible here because, you know, it's against the law here to do certain things now, to say certain things. So that's very much fear-based, you know.
And it could be from lack of awareness. It could be from lack of understanding.
And it could be
lack of
from a fear of being sued. Too many
or slapped with a fine.
Yeah.
Whereas
too many
I was very unconscious, I was coaching of different, very different ethnic backgrounds, all of whom were immigrants into Ireland. So they were all had been in Ireland less than 10 years. So they were still at that stage of their culture. And some of them had good experiences, some of them had bad. I know this. I would also say, look, I might be getting your culture wrong because I don't actually know it. And I was really blunt with them and said, I may get it wrong. Tell me if I do. I'm doing this because I want to learn. So keep talking to me. Never once did I ever have an issue. And I just, and actually they were wonderfully delighted. She said, oh, we don't mind that at all. Sure, what else would you do? They were practically telling me, but sure, we are different. We do things differently. Why would we be the same?
Well, yeah,
but they would just relate that but by not leaving it as like that, afraid to talk and having the elephant in the room, actually was way more effective to be upfront, say it, and then once you say it, you can tease it out anyway.
Yeah.
But the biases are there. I mean, I got some things, like where and a lot of it came around some of older women going into the workplace as to whether they could earn more than their husbands or not. And I'm sure this is culturally kind of very dubious, and can I do this? I ended up asking straight up. It worked wonders. So I kind of got confidence then. Just keep asking. Be prepared to say, I may have got this wrong because I have a very limited knowledge base, and been having the confidence myself to say, I've got a ton of biases. They may be wrong, and I'm open to learning. Never had a bother, ever.
Therapeutically as well, there's the hypnosis situation where if you are using a bias that is not actually resonating with the client and you've got them under so far and you say the wrong thing, they will come right back up, right out of there, because you've just gone book. And it's like, no, you can't say that to me. That's not what I think. That's not how I am. This is not who I am, And it doesn't matter if it's a different culture. It can be the same culture. It's just a different person with a different set of experiences. And I think that's the different part. I'm actually really habitually chopping words in bits. And I've been looking at culture, and of course the first part of culture is cult. And the thing about cult is belonging to a radicalized ideal of something. And I like to kind of play with that a little bit, because basically it's saying that, for me, cult is therefore a different way of doing things and a different way of believing something that's been gathered together and kind of seasoned, shall we say, so that it's kind of become something that is its own beastie. And that's why we have to, and because we tend to stay with our own biases and within our own little cultures, that we tend to be very suspicious of anything that might take our beliefs and values and our ideas and our biases and tell us that we're wrong.
I'm curious around the suspicious part, because I don't believe everyone has those suspicions. And I wonder if that is around how many different cultures you've been brought up around, or how many different subsets of people. And I wonder if there's something there. So I don't think I resonate with the being suspicious of others. I could be wrong. It could be an unconscious bias that I'm not aware of, and I'm now going to have to go and think about it.
You see, it's interesting. I wouldn't. Suspicion is a very kind of loaded word. It's a very semantic word, I know, but it seemed to be the only word that could come up at the time. It's one of those things that it's a case of not any word will do. And sometimes when you can't get the right one, you get one that's kind of almost there.
It'll kind of do the job.
It'll kind of do the job. But at the same time, it does open up discussion. And as long as it's opening up discussion and nothing else, then that's fine. But it's one of those things that when we're in a therapeutic situation, our ideas, suspicion is more like when we suspect that our client has a problem that is beyond the problem that they've come in with, which is actually a usual thing.
So I don't suspect that when I assume that one.
You see, suspecting it and assuming it is I think the assumption just takes that suspicion a little bit further on, and it's a fact, So through our experiences of working with people who are more or less going to be almost always within our known cultural bias because of who we've met and not just one culture, but
actually, given that we have more therapeutics happen over virtual worlds and virtually happening, that actually assumption that we were familiar with them is actually disappearing. Like, if I was only taking clients from Cork, I will have a certain amount of bias about my local people around me and their educational background and all the rest. But once I'm dealing with people whether it's in India or Australia or America or the UK, all bets are off. My assumption, it's my assumption, is that these people have very different cultural experiences from me. They have different biases, and I don't have a clue. Actually, in some respects, makes things clearer because I know I can't assume anything because I haven't got a clue, so that I'm actually as open as I'm capable of being, of questioning and clarifying. So it actually helps the therapeutic, the coaching process.
Yeah, so my joke and assumption was around the fact that usually what people are coming for isn't necessarily the only problem. So one of the ways I work with kinesiology is how we set the session up initially, and we've got one that is called client specified issue. Doesn't come up very often, and in all my time of having sessions done on me, maybe a handful were client specified issues, if that, over 14 years now.
Yeah, it's one of those things that when someone comes into us, they think they're coming in because this thing has happened and they're unhappy about it. But actually, when you get rid of that bias, that assumption, that initial idea of what it is, and you suddenly realise that actually it's been something that happened way back, or that they've subconsciously not actually noticed, but it's stopped in there.
And peeling back the layers of the onion.
Yeah, when you actually, and it does get to a point where you were only supposed to blow the bloody doors off, but there's a cultural reference, but it's one of those things that when they come in and suddenly, particularly under hypnosis, and we don't have to do it with any content at all, but we will find that the facial expressions sometimes when they're under hypnosis, you can tell that there's a wee bit of surprise there going on. There's a little bit of, why did I think that? Why did I say that? What's going on here? And suddenly you find that you're going down a little path, and as you're watching them, you're taking them down there, and you're sort of saying, why don't you go there and find out what's going on? But when you go there, you'll be fine, and you'll be doing this, and you'll be doing that. And sometimes when they come back up, the original issue they came in with is a little bit forgotten. But they still, they're like, I came in for this, but I don't think that was what was going on. And you're like, yeah, that's exactly what was not going on.
And then you get them to try and understand what that head nod meant, right?
Exactly. That's what I said yesterday. I said the other day, there's a confusion. It's a brilliant hypnotic tool. And when you're confused, you kind of, yeah, okay, whatever. But that's the magic of it as well. It's a case of we have to kind of park our bias, and we will have an idea. Oh, this is so and so, and this is what they're coming for. Therefore, I'm going to do this, 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 and this, or I'm going to hear this, 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 and this. And then they come in and they just totally blow you away because they don't do any of that.
That's why I don't plan anything out in my sessions. The only thing I plan to have is paper and pen.
I don't plan anything either, but I still have a kind of.
But what you're saying is, on a subconscious level, you are planning it because you've just said, so this is the person they're going to come in with this.
Unconsciously or universal mindly, I'm kind of looking at what my options might be. So I'm managing my own expectations, but at the same time, without them knowing it, I'm also managing theirs, which really is putting a blocker on some things. So I have to be able to park that when they come in and say, right, well, I'm ready for anything. So within this hour, we're going to have this happen, and we're going to find out what we need to do. However, it's almost like, I'm going to be a bit flippant here, so park your biases. It's almost like Zoom bingo. You know? Something comes up and you go, ding! And something else comes up and you go, ding! But at the same time, it's actually quite a good milestone in the situation, because you know it's kind of a way of knowing where you are in the session and what's going on. It's like knowing the seas around you, where it's shallow, where it's deep, where the rocks are. And I think that's what we all have to do to a certain extent, is be able to navigate. And so we're going to look to see if there are any potential rocks or whirlpools or interesting aquatic life going on.
Yeah, I think so. The way that I tend to work, whether it's the kinesiology on its own or the hybrid stuff I'm doing now, is that I start everything off by asking their system what it is they want to work on. So there was one situation quite earlier in bringing in the hypnotherapy aspects when the client told me what they wanted from me, and my thought was, oh, I remember in my training this was a technique to use. So I made sure I read through the process again, just so that it was still in my head. And the client came, I asked their system through my usual kinesiology techniques, and it was like, yeah, so that's not what we're doing today. We're doing something completely different. It was another hypnotherapy technique, but it wasn't the one that I had potentially made that assumption that I was going to be using. It was something completely different. And actually, the client really took well to it, but then the client system asked for that. So from that really early day of having that experience, I then just, as all of our tutors keep telling us, work your menu. And it is a case of work the menu with the client. What do you want off my menu today?
Yeah, it's a bit like when I cook, and if I cook something and Andrew likes it, he'll say to me, "You can do that again," and I something like, probably not.
So that's the difference. If I'm cooking, it's on a menu. It's off a recipe book.
Yes, I couldn't do it again because I have no idea what I put in it. And you know, because I just go into this, well, we'll have a bit of this and we'll have a bit of that, and oh, I haven't used that for a while, let's have a look at that and see what it tastes like if you put that in there. Thankfully, it's worked out that I haven't poisoned him so far, and he has actually managed to.
Well, your senses questionnaire would have been shorter if you had.
Oh dear.
Sorry, that was highly inappropriate.
That's very funny.
I must admit, Andrew does come in handy for these things.
looking at the biases from a different perspective, Leslie, what you and I do, probably more so than Mary, can be seen as being woo-woo, which is a lovely bias.
Oh, the wobble you. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
So what would you recommend or suggest for people who have that bias of, well, that's all woo-woo, there's no truth in it, there's no fact in it? What's your standpoint for having that conversation, or for helping your clients explain to their friends or family that this stuff works for them, to take that bias and...
Oh well, crikey, I mean, when it comes to the shamanic stuff, that's really interesting. When it comes to that, because trying to get somebody to to explain to someone else, well, there was this drumming, and then there was this thing that happened, and I had to go to this place, and I actually did have someone say to me, how long would it take to go into the forest, because they didn't have the right shoes with them. They thought we were going into a physical forest.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so that kind of expectation, that kind of no, this is a meditation.
Slightly different to that.
It's slightly different. There's no forest, but if there's no forest, how can I go in it? So there's this idea of this practicality, this pragmatism, that sometimes people actually, it's a bias that they really don't want to go there.
That was a fascinating bias. It was a concrete world they were going into, not something inside in their heads.
Yeah,
I'm fascinated.
I mean, for me, it is a concrete world that I go into, but it's just a different level.
Well, but with trees and not concrete, right?
Well, yeah, because concrete is. But
I wonder if perhaps.
Even at that, concrete has spirit. So.
But I wonder if that person, perhaps, like myself, is not able to visualize, and therefore.
Oh no, she was in there. She was.
Okay.
She was visual. She was definitely visual. We checked, and
so it was definitely a miscommunication slash.
It was a
bias.
A mismanagement of expectations on both sides.
And it is, I think we can sometimes be hard on ourselves too, though, when it comes to bias. Because I think when we when we become aware of a bias that we didn't realize we had, I think we can give ourselves a really hard time.
But we can only go as far as we can with it. It's like going back to the getting people to accept what we do as something that has tangible results at the end of it. You, Mary, as well, being a coach, it's not tangible. There's not a, take this pill and you'll be fine. It's a case of basically, how did you
come along and do the work?
Yeah. How did you do that? I didn't do it. You did it. No. I was asleep, or I was this, or I was. How did you do that?
And
that's like magic.
I do find that when you have clients with whom you actually do work where there's practical skills pieces, whether it's breathing exercises or finger tapping or whatever, or even if it's email management, when there's something really easy to grasp, they get that they've done something way faster. Whereas in that fact, that's not really the real work, but that's what they can connect on to. And when they do have it, it gives, certainly I find it gives me more time to do the more interesting work with them. So it kind of builds that sense of, she does do real things.
I think that the woo-woo aspect has something also to do with not looking foolish in front of their friends. Because there's I can't tell them that because they just ridicule me like there was no tomorrow. Interestingly, they will go and do things that are quite amazing to me, but for looking after themselves to a certain extent. There's also this idea in some cases that, well, maybe I don't really want to do that because for some reason I don't want to not do what I do, or I don't want to not think what I think. I don't want to not believe what I believe. Because
it's all mine. Don't touch it.
it's all mine. It's me. It's my identity. That's who I am in the world, and there's nothing you can do about who you are in the world. Really? Because if that was the case, I'd still be a veterinary nurse with a mop in one hand and a thermometer up a dog's bum in the other.
There's not really anywhere you can go from that now, is there, Mary?
No.
There you go.
Absolutely not.
It's true. When I was a vet nurse,
We don't need the details. I'm happy with not understanding about pets.
I would introduce myself as a vet nurse first, and then my name would come after.
But then that's the same with most people in their labels, isn't it? And it's the question of, what do you do? Well, that's not who you are, but for some reason we've assigned that as being our identity now.
But that's an interesting bias, isn't it? Because I'm biased due to the other person is not going to see me as an intelligent, hardworking, interesting person if I don't tell them, first of all, what it is that I do. It's almost like veganism.
Let's not open that can of worms.
Well, yeah, bias. How we react, how we use our words, how we explain ourselves and communicate it will bring about a bias somewhere along the line. Probably sooner rather than later. It's when we trip up over it and suddenly say, oh, I didn't realise I felt so strongly about that. Why did I get so emotional about that? But oftentimes we don't ask ourselves that at all.
And it is that shining a light on it, is because until you shine the light on something, you're not going to see that it exists.
Possibly
it's
turn the
there
torch off and not go there again. But
that's always an option.
yeah.
But for most things, until you actually highlight it, focus on it, look at it, you can't deal with it. So there is that piece of bring it into the light, bring the bias into the light, bring the assumptions and the suspicions and everything else that you've got going on. Bring it into the light and decide, am I going to put it back in the corner and switch the light off? Or am I going to approach it and deal with it?
However, of course, there is always the thing about once it's seen, it cannot be unseen. It
Depends on how strong a mind you've got, right?
It can be ignored.
Yeah.
But it's
and
always,
over time, it then disappears from consciousness.
yeah, but it's always going to sit there like a little bug on a toadstool going, still here.
But I think when you draw attention to it, that bringing attention to it changes it anyway, simply because
It kind of does.
the fact that you've brought attention to it, that
Yeah.
changes it too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the big word, isn't it? Change. Because we all have a bias attached to that, whether it's pro or con.
There are a lot of people that are totally terrified of change.
Which is an interesting thing to be terrified of.
Yeah. And let's face it, who's not gone through change over the last 2 years?
Well,
Of some way, shape or form.
Who's not gone through change since they became a fetus?
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but I'm more just thinking the last couple of years where things have been potentially forced on us to change and overcome and deal with and change how we're dealing with life.
And some biases actually came to the fore very, very quickly through that 2 years. And even although they were biases that were less than totally sensible, shall we say, they were still held on to and enjoyed, and almost like that little interesting character that I can't stand in that film, My Plaintiff.
Please don't ever do that face again.
I'm going to have to watch this again and see what that face was, so I don't do it again.
Oh, that was that. No, don't do that again.
Biased against my face.
That expression, yes. A little bit horrified.
Good, that was what was meant to happen. So, basically, therapeutically, because that's kind of what this is about, what we have to do is manage our biases, and understand that we have them, and possibly give ourselves a little bit of a talking to before we see anyone.
Or do we give ourselves permission to be human and do what Mary's suggesting and say, I might get this wrong. If I do, please let me know.
Yeah. Having got it wrong quite a few times and said I might get this wrong and then done it, sometimes it's quite sore when they tell you off.
But that becomes then how you process the telling off.
Yes.
Because then you just say, okay, I've learned something now.
Well,
I can do something with this.
It goes
I'm
right
not going
back
to make that mistake again.
It goes right back to the outcome of communication is in the result that you get.
Yeah.
And it depends on how you're communicating and what their expectations are.
And I guess those expectations and how we communicate is how we help them overcome their biases to come and see us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very good at turning around and saying to people, by the way, I'm probably going to say something that you're not going to like. However, if you sit with that, we can find out why it is that you don't like it, and then we can go past it and find out where the issue is.
And with the training that we've all got as well, it's also that we usually know where that line is, and that if it's going to push the client too far into discomfort, then we're probably not going to push them there, so they're still safe to come and see us.
Yeah, I think it's the terms in which it's couched. Pardon the pun. I think it's very interesting that when people don't see a couch in the office, also they're quite interested. No couch? What's going on? I don't get to lie down. No.
Mine's over there.
Yeah, mine's is actually in storage at the moment. But yeah, not that kind of couch. It's one of those things that when we are going to work, we don't have a toolbox that people can see. We don't carry a little bag with us and open it up and say, okay, this is going to be this and this is going to be that.
I've got a toolbox.
So have I.
No, but I'd literally bring it out whenever I've got a client.
I know you do, but that's for your kinesiology. I have a toolbox for my shamanic work too.
I don't have a toolbox.
See?
I don't have a physical toolbox.
Should we get you one, Mary, so you don't feel left out?
I think I'm feeling very depressed. Well, I suppose I can occasionally work with cards, so that'll be as far as I go. But very rare.
We don't exactly go about with a hard hat and a high-vis vest on.
No,
do we?
we don't. We don't.
My high-vis vest's over there too.
If you don't stop this, I'm going to do that face again. So, well,
Sorry.
Okay.
So before this totally unravels, I'm going to cut it on the bias and say
Yes, do.
thank you, ladies, for this evening. It's been great.
It was
fun.
lovely.
And,
Before we log off, should we actually tell everybody who we are, since we forgot to do that at the
do we
start?
really want them to know? Because basically, I don't really know.
Okay,
Oh.
we'll just put it in the comments below. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll put it in the comments.
Yeah, okay. Well, if they don't know us by now, and they can always look back at the last one because we told everybody then who we were, and there were even some more people there then too.
I don't think Mary was there.
I wasn't there, but that's
Oh
okay.
no, you weren't there.
No, that's
Oh,
okay.
you're just a secret then. Special secret.
Check the box below.
Yeah, check the box below.
Yeah.
And we'll be doing our usual bit. And don't forget to press the subscribe button wherever it is on the screen.
Since I don't have a background, there's not really a problem.
Okay.
But YouTube will put a nice subscribe button up somewhere. So anyway,
yeah.
go
Okay.
for it. Wrap us up, Leslie.
In the cloth of the threads of the story that we've just tried to manage together without fankling it all up, talking about bias and how we can actually possibly not be unbiased just because we have a mind that works that way. Then we're going to look forward and park our biases when our clients come to see us as much as possible, but we may actually have to use them as well because they can be interesting and resourceful tools. When it's time to use them, it will be the right time to use them, but always remember that just because you think it's so doesn't make it so, because someone else has always got another idea, another way of thinking, and another way of looking at stuff. So thank you everyone, and we will see you next month when I'm sure in about 5 minutes after I've cut this button off we will figure out what it is that we're doing and when. So until then, have fun, be well, be loved, and just be yourself.